one line that was implicit in the discussion that we had in the first two lectures, and that is the idea of pre-existing stories, the idea that there are stories around in a culture that are ready for representation and that come up and up again, and that they remain the same. That idea that you can see in the Lucrezia story that is passed around over thousands of years and that takes different shapes, but somehow the assumption is that it's the same story. And the thematic center, the thematic focus will be not an innocent victim whose innocence is somehow challenged over and over again, like in the previous two sessions, but the idea of a guilty, wicked woman whose guilt is never questioned. There is not a symmetry. Now, the prototype of this type of stories is the stepmother who seduces her innocent stepson. And there is a tradition around Phaedra that is comes from the Greek tradition and goes into French and German. And then there is the story that has been handed over in monotheistic traditions like Bible and Islam, Potiphar's wife. Now that's the story we are going to talk about today and next Thursday. And then next Friday we are going to do something that I plan to do in the course as of next Friday. It's going to be a mess. I plan to do one session on the viewer and voyeurism, but that's going to be two. So we'll have a back leg then, and then I'll announce weekly what we are going to be able to do and what not. But today and next Thursday will still be in the schedule. Although I'm not exactly going to do what's in the description, we are not going to talk so much about space and time, because when studying that question, I was more and more aware that that was even not an interesting question to begin with. So I try to, although I'm going to talk about time, I'm not going to talk so much about space. And well, we'll see. And you're more than welcome to jump in and interrupt and make comments. Now, about this story, let's just the assumption that it is a story. And of course, I don't believe a word of that, and I will later challenge that. But now here's one comment, for example, on Thomas Mann's novel. And Thomas Mann's novel is the case today that we will end up talking about, although it will take 40 minutes before we get there. Thomas Mann wrote this wonderful 1,200-page novel, Joseph and His Brothers, right? And here is a critic on this novel. The universal story of the chaste youth and the lustful stepmother is best known to Western readers in the biblical account of Joseph, etc. And thus he begins his article on the story. Now what he does there is already fixing the story, right? The story. It's not a story that Thomas Mann is writing, but it's a story that was pre-existing. And that's the point I want to talk about. And in fact, he says, he uses the term universal, the universal story of the chaste youth and the lustful stepmother. And that term, in fact, summarizes all the terms in which this kind of stories have been discussed in literature. And the most typical case, of course, is mythical stories, myth. Myth being kind of excessively fixed, reified, petrified stories. Now, terms that surround myth, and we will talk about myth just because that is the strongest case of this issue, are eternity, transhistoricality, truth, similarity, imitation, versions, one after the other, etc. Now, beginning his statement and his article, in fact, by the word universal, is, in fact, inserting himself, I'm talking about this critic here that I just quoted, inserting himself into the discourse, which he might also have set out to deconstruct, but there is no such endeavor at all in the paper. He just takes that assumption, brings it to the discussion of Thomas Mann, and Thomas Mann is in fact exited through the back door. Now, why is Thomas Mann out as soon as you bring this notion in? Because taking the universality of the story for granted, the author, this critic's name is Johannan, I don't think it matters much, but that's the name. The author detaches the text from its historical and discursive contingency. And in fact, the word story, the use of the word story does that. Not universal being only a qualifier by the word story. The title of his paper is Hebraism and Hellenism in Thomas Mann's story. That is, the story was there and now Thomas Mann has one of those. And Thomas Mann didn't write such a story, I would argue. He used a story, maybe, but he did not write the story. He wrote a 1,200-page novel in which he inserted what he calls only an episode, if an important one, in the life of Jacob's son. So what is for Johannan the story is for him an episode, and the difference, as we will see, is absolutely crucial. Now, the discussion that I want to conduct for these two sessions is what is it that makes this idea of myth and of a pre-established story so attractive? How do we deal with it? What is really happening when people pick up such a universal story and rewrite it? What are they really doing? And how can we insert our own readings of these stories into that discussion? And Thomas Mann is a neat case because he wrote this novel in, I guess, 1932 or 33. It was published just before the war, at the time of raising Nazism. And it's very clear that it would be really kind of easy to say, well, he wanted to get away from, and that's in fact said a lot about Thomas Mann's novel, he wanted to get away from the historical reality of the day. Now, of course, and then it was neat of him to take a Jewish subject because that was at least something. But that is all, and that's a little bit too easy to deal with the case of Thomas Mann, who is an interesting case precisely in terms of the historical time and the historical position he took. Now, Thomas Mann is also interested for this in terms of the theoretical discussion we are having, because he was very critical of the myth he was dealing with. He was not only a myth writer, but also a myth critic. And he is explicitly criticizing the traditions. So we have here a very complex case if we want to talk about what these stories then could be. I quote from the foreword to the novel, where he talks about the section Joseph in Egypt in which this episode takes place. There are 4 or 5 sections in the whole novel, I don't remember. Joseph in Egypt seems to me unquestionably the artistic zenith of the work, if only on account of the humane vindication that I had undertaken in it, the humanization of the figure of Potiphar's wife. And now here comes the description of the story. The mournful story of her passionate love for the Canaanite major domo and her pro forma husband. Now this is a very interesting quote, I think, because he uses also the word story, but he in a completely different sense. He's not talking about a universal story, he's going to make it a different story. He makes it the mournful story. He is referring to his own specific story, his account, which he gives this telling adjective mournful, which turns it completely upside down if you look at it, because of course the mourning is done on the other side. He's not talking about Joseph, but about the woman. And in which he includes the basically absent character, Potiphar himself. Absent he had to be for the story to be possible at all. And yet he includes it in this description of the story. By writing about him, he includes him, signifying his necessary absence otherwise by this adjective pro forma that goes with husband, and that is already bringing in a view of the story that is not at all, let's say, implied in this universal story of the chaste youth, etc. As a husband, Potiphar is only a signifier, an empty form, and it is the absence, empty form in the sense of pro forma, and it is the absence of the signified husband that triggers the story and makes it mournful. That's how I interpret this statement of Mann about his novel. Now, in the critic who talks about the universal story of the chaste youth takes the innocence of the youth for granted. Thomas Mann does not at all. Hence, this is an addition of the critic. Since the critic is talking about Thomas Mann's novel, it's really strange where the novel challenges the innocence of the young man.
So isn't the critic talking about the source, not Mann's novel?
Well, that is exactly the problem. What's he talking about when he's discussing Thomas Mann's novel and summarizes and says this is a novel about the universal story of the innocent youth. And then he doesn't mention the problem that in the first place the youth is not innocent. In the second place, the woman is not his stepmother. And if you think, why is that? Why bringing in stepmother? Well, that's an Oedipal interpretation, right? That's an absolutely Freudian interpretation. Okay, but then the youth is not innocent, because the Oedipal youth is not innocent. On the contrary, he is cosmically guilty of the whole thing. So it's an interesting fallacy that we have here. And I'm not trying to pick on this particular critic, but just to raise the problem and use his language for that problem. And in fact, the problem that we have here is the problem of myth criticism as a field in comparative literature, which tends to be somehow conflated with myth itself. That is, myth criticism tends to have the same fallacies and tends to buy into a notion of myth that should be discussed and criticized in the first place. And according to one author who writes about this problem, a certain Raaf, this is a persistence, of course, of romanticism and conservatism, occasioned, in his words, by the fear of history and freedom, the fear of making choices. And this Raaf concludes, the craze for myth is the fear of history. Now, that's an interesting notion, and that's where I want to start off. What is that fear of history, and how does visuality come in that play? And just to launch an idea that I will pick up later and next week, myth is very present in painting. And you could maybe suggest that the interest in visual representations of this kind of stories could be related to the fear which informs myth criticism. That is, painting confines the story to a kind of immobilization, including the aspects of the story that are the most troublesome. I don't know, this will come up later, of course. It's just something that I would like to keep in your minds. Now, the ambivalent attitude towards time is what I want to get at. There is a difficulty with time that you can see very forcefully in this idea of myth because of the appeal to the length of time as evidence that a story is mythical, as part of the definition, in fact. And that idea of universality, of course, is the outcome of that. To put it bluntly, myths exist on the basis of so much time, they are so old, that time becomes irrelevant and that they become forever. Now, representing myths visually helps at the other end. That is, that helps to the idea that time is so long that it becomes irrelevant. That idea is strengthened in visual representations, while the idea of time within the story, which is, of course, the problem that we will have to talk about, how do you visually represent time, is confined in a spatial frame, or so it seems. And we will have to challenge that, of course. I will have to come back to that when we look at the visual works next week, and that's why I gave you this assignment to stare for 20 minutes at that thing, with the idea that you're reading a novel. Well, you don't read a novel in 20 minutes, but I won't overdo it. But try to read this rather than just take it in. That is, take your time and be aware that you're putting time. Now, the idea of myth in myth critical discourse, that is, in this traditional comparative myth critical discourse, seems to have the attraction of truth, which is interesting because it's basically fictional material. And this truth has to do with the fear of history and the fear of discourse. Suzanne Langer, for example, a philosopher in the 1950s, wrote in a statement that's very common to myth criticism, very characteristic. Myths are not bound to any particular words, nor even to language. Now, so far we agree, right? It may even be told in painting, acted or danced. We agree. Without suffering degradation or distortion. Now, what does that imply? That part implies that there is something out there that could eventually be distorted and that could be that could suffer degradation. Now, this statement is so negative. It's saying myth. What's a myth? It's something that's not bound by language, not bound by words, and it does not suffer. Now, that's an entirely negative definition that tends to obliterate that last part of it without the suffering, etc., which is, in fact, conveying this implication. And I would think that what Raaf described as the fear of history is, in Langer's statement, quite close to the fear of the signifier. And indeed, historicity and discursivity are part of the same problem. This is for next week. But the fear of the signifier, and I use the word signifier because it's kind of a nice word, but the sign would also do. The fear of the signifier hides in turn another fear. And what fear is that? If you think that the shifting signifier, the Lacanian idea that the signifier is constantly shifting, is inaccessible and versatile, is as frightening as the presence of the signifying subject, where this action, this movement begins. And that signifying subject has to remain out of the idea of myth. That is, if meaning is unstable in, let's say, in Lacanian theory, if meaning is unstable, it is because of the very split between the subject that tells a story about itself and the subject it tells about, right? And if you are going to take the implications of that, you cannot have a story that is pre-existing. Now, the attraction of myth is that its universalism, the universalism of the idea of myth, allows the concealment of that split between the subject, the signifying subject, and the subject in the story. And this split necessitates eternity, objectivity, universality, in order to help the subject to get rid of time and space of contingency, of itself. And that is, let's say, my hypothesis why, and we are going to talk over and over again about this in the practice of the analysis, why I think it is attractive to assume that there are stories out there. And I would oppose to that idea that if Suzanne Langer thinks that the change of signifying system does not distort myths, that is because there is nothing that can be distorted. There is nothing out there. And that is that myth would be a sort of an empty screen. A myth, a so-called pre-existing story is an empty screen, a structure rather than a story, a structure that helps the individual, that provides the individual a kind of a pseudo-stability, which helps overcoming the feeling of contingency. So it's an illusionary mirror, a screen. And the idea of screen, an empty screen, and something that you act upon and then use and reflect back to yourself is, of course, a psychoanalytic notion. And it's, in fact, very close to the notion of transference, which is the idea that the patient in a psychoanalysis uses the empty screen that the analyst is to project stories on this person who is not a person but a screen at that moment, and who can take, because it's a screen, he can take the roles of the mother, the father, whoever, and the patient is talking to this person as if he or she were the mother or the father or whoever, and not the analyst today. Now, this idea of transference has been picked up in literary theory a lot, and among many people, Jane Gallup has written about it in a very short, very interesting article in Poetics in 1984, where she makes transference the key word of a criticism, a kind of criticism that would deconstruct the authority relation inherent in interpretation. That is, according to her, interpretation is always an exercise of power, and a power that is structured upon this transference interaction. And if you analyze that transference, you can get around or underneath or behind or whatever the metaphors, spatial metaphors, are that authority relation. That is, you can turn it upside down and try to see where you stand yourself in this process. And I think that is an interesting thing to pick up. And I would like to pick it up when we talk about these texts. But one way to get rid of this of these pre-established notions and things is to play the game, and we're going to play that game today, of analyzing all kinds of discourses on the same, and give them the same status, that is scholarly discourse and literary discourse and visual discourse, and not make any hierarchy among them. And so just to begin the exercise, I don't, are they there? No, they are not there. I tried to bring, but I did not bring the definitions. Oh no, I put that in the assignment. The definitions in Laplanche and Pontalis, the Language of Psychoanalysis, which is a very scholarly and excellent work that gives you entries on the basic concept of psychoanalysis. Now, the first thing I did when I wanted to talk about myth was to look up myth. That seemed a thing to do in a dictionary of psychoanalysis, which is a discipline that builds all its major theories on myths. And there was no myth as an entry. And that was the first interesting thing. So that we have an empty, not an empty screen here, but we have an empty signifier, a negative signifier. There is a gap that we will have to deal with. And in fact, there was a very nice absence there, because when I then began to think about where could it be, it has to be hidden somewhere. Where is the description of myth? I looked at the things that seemed to me the closest to myth, and that was fantasy and primal fantasy. And in fact, the notions of myth are exactly there in between, in the difference. And so what I asked you to look up those definitions, because you could see yourself. And if you didn't do it, I'll just read them quickly, just the definition themselves that are in the dictionary are printed in bold characters, and then he develops in regular characters. Now, fantasy, and I'll first read both, and just let you. Did you actually look them up or not?
Well, they're for next week.
Oh, are they for next week? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is we're messing up already. Okay, I'll read them, and you'll think, and then I'll see how I can get around the fact that you don't have them. Okay, I underline important words, right? Fantasy, first. Imaginary scene in which the subject is a protagonist, representing the fulfillment of a wish. In the last analysis, an unconscious wish, in a manner that is distorted to a greater or lesser extent by defensive processes. Primal fantasy. Primal fantasy is somehow closer to myth, I thought. Primal fantasy. Typical fantasy structures: intrauterine existence, primal scene, castration, seduction, which psychoanalysis reveals to be responsible for the organization of fantasy life, regardless of the personal experience of different subjects. According to Freud, the universality of these fantasies is explained by the fact that they constitute a phylogenetically transmitted inheritance. Now, was this enough to give you a feeling of the difference? That there is a huge difference in vocabulary, in discourse between those. Now, this is really, I found this really absolutely flabbergasting. The definition of fantasy is very narratological. It has terms like scene, protagonist, subject. I can describe narrative in those terms. Now, the term subject refers to the split I talked about, typical of any discourse that is in the least autobiographical, between the subject of and the subject in the fantasy. You know that in autobiography you have that problem that when there is this I, you don't know if that's the I who's writing or the I who's living the experience. Now, that split brings a kind of eccentricity which language and representation in general display if you look at it. And that split is particularly acute in so-called first-person narrative. But equally, via the concept of projection, and we'll talk a lot about projections here. and that of fantasy itself, in fact, in all narrative. So these are this split is very important. You could say that narrative in general is the exemplary type of discourse where difference and deferral is generally thematized, if you believe Peter Brooks with his idea that narrative is nothing else but a deferral of the ending. Then you have here something really interesting about narrative in this definition of fantasy. Now, there is a double teleology implied in the phrase representing the fulfillment of a wish. Imaginary scene, etc., representing the fulfillment of a wish. Both representation and wish in a narrative coincide in a satisfactory ending, and that's in fact Peter Brooks' definition of the narrative. Now, the term scene implies a plot and staging of the plot, so that's again a double term, a mise en scène, a staging. And it also begins to introduce, of course, our topic visuality. Imaginary and distorted, and hence the fictional status of the scene, and remind, of course, the myth-critical discourse. Now, the distortion here, I read again, representing the fulfillment of a wish in a manner that is distorted to a greater or lesser extent by defensive processes. Now, this distortion, according to the syntax of the sentence, this distortion refers to the manner of representation, not to the wish or its fulfillment. It is the representation itself that's distorted. In other words, the agent of distortion is the focalizer, not the protagonist in this definition. It is the subject of the image, the producer of the image, the subject of vision, who is held responsible for the distortion. Now, we'll come back to this. This is really interesting. Reading this definition, we can hardly wonder that the most celebrated myths in Western culture have come to us through the stage, through Greek tragedy, and that they have been reconfirmed so often in painting only underlines this aspect, that there is this visual representation that is needed to make fantasy become a fantasy. Now, the definition of primal fantasy. Now, do you have that in mind still? Typical fantasy structures which psychoanalysis reveals to be responsible for the organization of fantasy life, etc. Now, completely different in tone. Different in tone, different in discourse. It is much more static and much more meta-linguistic. It's much more scholarly in wording, if you look at the choice of the words. If fantasy is a scene, primal fantasy is the structure of that scene. If fantasy is literary or otherwise artistic discourse, fantasy in the sense of fiction, primal fantasy is critical discourse, clearly, in this definition. We are talking about structures, about responsibility, organization, etc. The subject, and hence in the first definition, remember, the subject that had the fantasies, is disposed of in this second. We have no subject here. Primal fantasy is described in a positivistic discourse, which is characterized by the attempt to do away with subjectivity, at the cost, however, of personification. Primal fantasy is responsible for something that happens to the life of the subject. Now, how can that be? That is just a rhetorical device. Now, in terms of the first definition of fantasy, we could venture that the definition of primal fantasy reveals an attempt to get rid of the double subject by eliminating the focalizer, the subject of experience, who would precisely be able to bridge the gap between the subject of the unconscious discourse, the scene, and its protagonist. That is, what is happening here is absolutely schizophrenic, and this notion of primal fantasy is as discourse, I mean, we're not talking about a real analysis, of course, is anti-analytical. The universality implied in this separation between fantasy and its subject, and here we get at myth as a subjectless fantasy, that universality that is implied in the separation between fantasy and subject, between scene and representation, including its distortion, is not argued in this piece. It is not even stated, but it is taken for granted and explained. It is not in need of explanation, apparently. It's explained, he says, the universality of these fantasies is explained by the fact that they constitute a phylogenetically transmitted inheritance. Did you want to ask a question? Oh, okay. Please ask questions if this is going too fast or if it's too messy, if you want clarification. Now, narrativity comes into the focus here at the end of the definition, precisely when the explanation comes. And this is why I bring this up also, because we're going to talk about Freud, another Freudian text. This is a Freudian text, but not by Freud. The phrase phylogenetically transmitted inheritance introduces a plot, a dynamic aspect, and two fallacies, I'm afraid. The first fallacy consists of the so-called third-person narrative fallacy. I introduced the term, it's not an existing fallacy, but I think it's a fallacy, which is the very attempt to get rid of the split subject, the split between subject and protagonist, by eliminating the subject, thus breaking with the protagonist, who becomes the third person, isolated, out there. You see what I'm getting at with myth? Radically inaccessible. The word fact symptomatizes this objective fallacy. We could call it an objective fallacy. It's making something an object by eliminating its subjective aspects. That implies attitudes close to positivism, objectivism, and mythical thinking, as it is displayed in myth criticism, as we have seen it in the beginning. Now, the second fallacy in this final statement about the universality is explained by, etc., oh my God, is the narrative fallacy. The narrative fallacy, which consists of replacing explanation by stories. That is, he says this fact of the universality is explained by the fact of, is explained by the fact that they constitute a phylogenetically transmitted inheritance, which is a story. Now, these two fallacies are needed in order to fit the second definition, primal fantasy, as a subclass in the first, which it should be, of course. Fantasy is a larger category than primal fantasy, because you have primal fantasies and other fantasies in fantasy. But that is very difficult because the definitions are completely on different levels. One is meta-discursive in relation to the other. So you have to distort here something in order to fit them. Now we get some insight in why myth, as a concept in psychoanalysis, cannot afford definition. Why this gap in the dictionary? It is because it is the paradox itself in which this argument is called. The argument tries to explain structures by stories, or to use Thomas Pavel's nice terms in an article in Style, to replace articulation with origin. Right? That's what, in fact, is happening in this distortion between the two definitions. And the inherent subjectivity with the pseudo-objectivity of the scientific myth of phylogenetic explanation beginning. This theory of Freud's about the phylogenetic development of the species as analogous to the development of the individual is a kind of new Eden story. It's beginning at the infant and the young child and the Oedipal stage, etc. It's going through the whole thing again. So I want to bring up that story itself, the story that is alluded to here, as, again, a piece of mythical discourse. But what Freud is doing there is accomplishing this very act of explaining by a story the human development. And in the text he does that in, he absolutely confirms to this discourse on primal fantasy. The replacement of a kind of logical articulation by a non-falsifiable origin. We never know. We can never know if that was true or not. And that's what makes it mythical in a way. Is an attempt to impose on notions that are alien to it a family structure. Ideas, fantasies get a father and become sons. And what you get then is a staging of the conflict between historicity and universalism, which is in fact the conflict we are talking about when we talk about myths. That is staged in this explanation that is the utmost universality, is in this view the utmost historicality. We go back to the past and we create a universal explanation by making the story of the human species a very historical one. And without, of course, we're not talking about arguments and evidence, we're talking about a discursive structure here. Via the implicit argument that assumes that the further removed in the past, the older, the truer the story is. And the more general its range of application. And that's how this idea of a story out there that is inherent in the concept of myth is possible. And so Freud is doing that in his own scientific way. So the basic message of myths in this view would be then what I think, I'm now, let's say, rewording the two definitions I was talking about. What I think, that is, my fantasies wishfully distort or not, is the truth because it has always been so, right? That is sounds a little childish, but it's in fact exactly what he's doing in those definitions. So the authority of time becomes the historical projection of the unwillingness to assume the historicality of the wishes of the subject, of the I. Every accent placed in a representation of a myth on its historical contingency and its subjective discourse undermines this authority. And that's why we have to approach myth as already universal and already out there, and everything that we do is just the fringes, and we will say, well, he takes this from the Hellenic tradition and this from the Hebraic tradition, but it's always unimportant by definition. Now, Freud, I want to briefly talk about Freud, and not very long, although I have a long part on that, but I think the Thomas Mann is the most interesting case that we want to have time to address today. Freud's Totem and Taboo, which I probably assigned for next week, right? Oh, I'm sorry about that. But you have a fragment on your handout. Just take it and look at it. On the second page, I guess. It's just something that I wanted to let you at least taste a little bit of, even if you don't have time to read the whole Totem and Taboo, which is worth reading. I'm afraid we don't have any other. You'll have to look with somebody else. The structure of Totem and Taboo is that the question is how came the Oedipus complex about? And then he talks about totems and taboos, and then he wants to set up this story about an original, the original fall. It's exactly parallel to the Eden story about the creation of the human couple and the fall. There is something that happened in the past. Now, the interesting thing that I wanted to talk about is that he begins by disclaiming originality, by quoting fathers, quoting authorities. He has tons and tons of quotes of anthropologists and historians who bring in evidence that what he is going to say in the very last chapter of his book is true. That conflict is, there is this authority, and then on the other hand there is his Oedipal claim to originality, because he is going to be the big guy who comes up with the ultimate theory about this. Now, it's really interesting if you look at the discourse again. There is a conflict between those two moves, to rely on authorities and to bring in his own new thing. When he begins the story itself, I think it's in the second paragraph. Can I quickly look at your? Okay. Okay, B. It's quote B that I'm first talking about, and then I will come back to quote A. There is this sentence: one day, and this is embedded in a lot of quotes from other people. One day, the expelled brothers joined forces, slew and ate the father, and thus put an end to the fatherhood. Here's the story. Could be in the Bible so quickly. I mean, it's just one sentence. Now, this passage is embedded, as I said, with in all kinds of notes, and one note is, in fact, quoted here on the passage itself about a certain Atkinson who brought in all the evidence and even this theory, who had the same theory. Now, here you have a problem when you are a scholar. We all have that problem all the time. We pick up ideas that are in the air, but then we want to claim that we are the big inventors of the ideas. How are you going to do it? Well, he does it this way. He differentiates in the discourse between durative and unique singular events. Atkinson was representing this happening in a durative, as a durative act. Combined a text, renewed and renewed again, combined a text, renewed again and again. That is, he is describing a state of civilization at some point. And Freud's contribution to the discussion amounts to the turning of this durative act into a singular event. No wonder he uses the fairy tale convention, one day, once upon a time. Whereas at the same time, trying to avoid, as he says in a footnote again, the footnote is after one day, to avoid the erroneous impression which this exposition may call forth by taking into consideration the concluding sentence of the subsequent chapter. Now, there is a term for this, and that's mystification. You know, when you were a child, you had birthday parties, and they sent you to one place, and there you found a letter, and you were sent to another place, and then you were sent to another place, and you ended up finding the award. Now, that is the game he's playing here. He's quoting, he says, one day. Now, why do we need a footnote with one day? I thought he's now going to say, this is only a joke that I'm using this fairy tale convention. No, he's going to say, don't get an erroneous impression. Go to the next page. And what you get is that when you find the footnote, it took me a while because you have chapters and sections. When I finally found a footnote, it said, believe it or not, in the beginning was the deed. Now, I could not believe that. I mean, that came straight from the Bible. Now, this is, I'm not trying to make a fool of Freud. Of course I am, but that's my private pleasure. But this is a mythical text, and that's how I read it. I have a lot of respect for many of Freud's ideas. I think this is not the strongest of his theories, and nobody thinks so today. But it's an interesting mythical text. And again here we have this ambiguity in the use of spiritual paternity. He claims and disclaims the story. And this story is really his most creative and most fanciful theory, his most creative fantasy. And he claims authority of storytellers like Darwin and Fraser, who in turn were big storytellers who accumulated stories in their work. And this is supposed to be the most universal story because it's going to turn the Oedipus story into something that has always been there in the beginning, was the deed. And it is a story that he reveals in this sentence, one day, which is a very interesting sentence, just like once upon a time, if you think about it, because it's putting time as an excuse to take things out of time, right? When you read once upon a time, you know there's not ever been a time. You suspend willingly your disbelief when you read that. And that's in fact what he's doing here, but using time. Now, this chapter that this is taken from, which is the final chapter after 200 pages or 150 pages of just boring quotes, the chapter opens with a sentence that stages the focalizer, whose position Freud wants us to share. And that's in the beginning that you have there, quote A. I had to put that first because that's the first in his text. Let us now envisage the scene of such a totem meal, and let us embellish it further. Right? That is, let's make a picture. That is what he needs to get you to buy his Once Upon a Time. You first have to make it into a picture. And that is the staging of not only this scene that we are going to witness, but also of us as viewers. That is, we are being talked here into a visual position that is, in fact, I think is the position that we take when we read or think we read a mythical text. That is the position where the object is there, complete. That's the idea about visual, the distinction between verbal and visual, although both are obviously materially ready there when you start to read. We think that the picture is there where the story you have to go through, right? Now, that's why I asked you to read this in a verbal way and not in a visual way. Now, what we have here is a very interesting cultural tendency to deal with history in order to get rid of it. And now we are going to look at Thomas Mann. What did he do? And remember, Thomas Mann is a very self-conscious modernist writer who wrote at the time of rising Nazism a novel about a Hebrew myth. Now, we cannot believe that he would just pick up a story that's out there just to be nice to the Jews, maybe, to take a story. That's a little bit cheap as a consolation to say, well, I have to get out of history, but I will do something that you will like. Now, my claim will be that it is a deeply anti-fascist novel. And his claim in the beginning, in the quote that I read to you about his claim that the Joseph in Egypt episode is the artistic zenith of the work, I strongly think that he's right in that claim. I also strongly think that it is the climax of the work in artistic terms because it's also the most interesting in ideological terms. And so I'm going to make a big claim about literary value here. We are not supposed to do that these days, but I like it because I like this novel very much. Okay, now, we have a problem when we look at the Thomas Mann because Mann is posing as a myth writer and as a myth critic, both. But remember, we had this idea of transference. We saw Freud, by the way, transferring on this historical theory his own position as a son who has to rival against his father, etc. Now, we have a problem with Thomas Mann because he explicitly claims to be humanizing Potiphar's wife, which is very nice for us feminists, but what about transference? Transference is supposed to be unconscious, so we have a problem. His polemic against the tradition that condemns the woman, there is a long tradition, of course, of rewriting and painting of this story as the story of the wicked woman. It becomes the witch later, who seduces little children. And all those fairy tales about little children seduced by a witch with sweets is, of course, another version of this whole story, of this whole notion, of this whole structure. Now, he is polemic against that. And he's also displaying, in fact, a polemic reaction against the function of transference itself. He's saying, in this claim about his ideological challenging of the story, he is in fact claiming that this function of transference in the myth has to be deconstructed somehow, and that's what he does. He complains about a biblical story that he worked on in these words: the biblical meager what was lacking the how and the why. Life's circumstantiality was missing. He says that not in the foreword, but in an interview. Now, what he's saying there is, there was a story, it was in the Bible, I used that source, but there was not enough, right? So he's already, we don't have anything more to say because he's already admitting himself that he is making it up, that he has to fill it in. And so what can we do? Now, this complaint, it looks very plausible that the biblical account is so meager because you have one page in the Bible and he has 1,250. And so we can't win. But it's still, I maintain it's ill-grounded if we take the proportion in the biblical account literally. In the proportion between life circumstantiality and the factual event in the Bible is as unequal as in Mann's novel itself. He takes, let's say, 100 pages, while there are 1,200 in the whole, and the Bible takes one verse out of 12 or something. I mean, it's the same kind of proportion. There is a number, in the Bible, there's a number of circumstantial clauses that literally circumscribe the event, and then, like in Freud's text, very suddenly it's there. I don't know if you were sensitive to that aspect when you read it. You have this, and then he said, and he came, and he did that, and then she did that, etc. And then suddenly, in one verse, you have the whole seduction scene. Now, the dialectic between the singular and the durative that we saw in Freud's myth is overwhelmed in this biblical story by a predominance of speech events, and I don't know if you realize that. speech events that are repetitive, that narratologically, in that they are narrated several times and even stylistically. And that has to do with the Hebrew, but it's nevertheless functional in this case. In the Hebrew, every declarative verb is repeated. It says, and he went and said, saying. But now here he is going to say, and he went and he said, saying, and then he said, and he said, and he said. It is really a little too much. So we have to keep in mind that the speech in the Bible, in the biblical account, speech, the act of speaking, is very much emphasized. And even in terms of biblical Hebrew, it's overdone. Now, again, we have no case because 1,250 pages is a good case to say that there also is a kind of overdoing of the verbal in the novel, right? So we have a problem again. It's almost exasperating. Now, if there are conventions which allow the visual representations of actions, the visual representation of speech in painting seems to stretch the medium to its limits, and we will talk about next week about comic strip solutions and other solutions that help to represent speech. And we could say that by representing speech, in visual art, visual and verbal media change places. If you think of the common idea, which of course we don't want to believe in, that paintings work with icons and literature with symbols. Now, Thomas Mann missed the circumstantiality in the Genesis text. Now, which circumstantiality can he mean if it's not disproportion, and if he in fact doesn't have as strong a case as we would think if you look at the relation between description of the whole setting and then the event? Maybe he is interested in one specific aspect of life, the one he explicitly claims to be interested in, the woman's subjectivity, when he says, I'm going to humanize this woman. Indeed, juxtaposing her to the man, to Joseph and her pro forma husband, Mann transfers a preoccupation of his own on the screen. So I'm going to make the claim that although he is explicitly meta-critical, doing myth criticism in his novel, he's also transferring more beyond what he in fact is planning to do. Now, and what is happening in fact, and this is going to be the big issue in this novel. Did any of you read the novel? No? It's a wonderful novel, but you need 4 weeks. Now, from the very beginning of this exasperatingly long novel, Joseph is represented, he's the first character that comes up, represented as a sexually ambivalent character. The first scene represents him daydreaming at night, but it's still daydreaming, fantasizing in the moonlight. A youth famed for his charm, and charming especially by right from his mother, who had been sweet and lovely like the moon when it is full, and like Ishtar's star when it swims mildly in the clear sky. Now this is more than just posing that he has something, that he looks like his mother, which is not a big deal, of course. It is sweet and lovely like the moon, and you know that the moon tends to stand for the feminine, and especially when it's full, and then Ishtar is a goddess, and when it is swimming mildly and the fluid stands for the feminine, it's almost a cliche overdone. Now, Joseph's more or less explicit femininity is Thomas Mann's response to the biblical phrase, and I say response, not rewriting. And he was beautiful of appearance and well-favored of sight, of face, which is again a doubling of the statement. Mann extensively discusses his view that the relation between beauty and femininity is a subjective association confirmed by intersubjective agreement. And this is interesting since this is a visual thing, this beauty. What does it mean to be beautiful as a man? And his argument is that that is something that has to do with femininity. Now, Joseph, moreover, as he knew himself, subjective, and as everybody told him, intersubjective, was both beautiful and well-favored, a condition which certainly embraces a consciousness of femininity. So we have a relation between beautiful and feminine that is doubly established as subjective and intersubjective. And we'll come back to this is very important in the whole novel. Now, this chiastic expression of the association and its subjective roots seems to emphasize a consciousness of the distortion of the transference of Mann's own preoccupation on the screen provided by the bare, meager biblical words. The episode with Potiphar's wife is, as Mann claims, an integrated part of Joseph's life. Remember, he said, an episode, if an important one, in the life of Jacob's son. And therefore, there is no limit to the projection of features of the ambiguous youth whose status as the true son of Rachel is defined by his very ambiguity, by being an exceedingly attractive man, confronting desire in and as other. That is, there is the first thing that you realize when you read the novel is that there is a lot of desire going on, but you never know who is initiating it. And for good reasons, because desire is presented as something that is around, and he's the center of it. But is he the center in the sense of source, or in the sense of thematic center? It happens to him, and the desire focuses on him. Now, wherever Mann is polemically or otherwise discussing the mythical traditions, and he does so, there is a lot of what we used to call authorial interventions. Does that ring a bell? The narrator comes in and stops the story, like in Jacques Le Fataliste as the most exasperating case, comes in and comments. Now, he's discussing the Greek, the Arabic, and the Hebrew texts that represent his screen, let's say. He is not transferring when he's doing that, but he's deconstructing the transferences of others. That is, he's claiming that things have been wrongly understood, that people have distorted, etc. So he's playing that game of the myth critic. So there's no point in taking this whole episode as evidence of another myth in the sense that we are developing now as a case of transference, because a lot of it is myth criticism. Although of a much less predisposed kind as most scholarly myth criticism on this case. But Mann cannot escape the mythical dynamics, at least we have to find his transference, or my case is ruined. He cannot escape the mythical dynamics he tries to undo by replacing it with his conscious preoccupation. He represents, and here's how he does it. First of all, he represents an excessively narcissistic Joseph, guilty, not innocent, guilty of hubris, of arrogance, too confident of his capacity to defend his somewhat unmotivated chastity. Now, the strangest feature of this character seems to me the fact that he completely he's described in the most appealing ways. He's really, if you like young men, it's just the most beautiful young man. Now, he loses his charm completely as soon as he becomes socially accomplished. Once he's viceroy of Egypt, he becomes fat, he loses his hair, he's pleased with himself, sure of his power, he's just unbearable. Something must have gone wrong between this absolutely charming youth and this guy who, he doesn't describe him as an old man or as a middle-aged man, but just as an unpleasant character. So what went wrong? Now, he has lost his ambiguity, that's what happened, and the double attraction it warranted. He has in fact lost himself. There is hardly any continuity between the ambiguous Joseph and the accomplished man. You don't recognize him. If you would take passages from the beginning and from the end, you would say it's a different character. It's almost postmodern in this discontinuity. His narrative position has completely changed and has been severely reduced to that of an ordinary character, an ordinary man, with no traces of the position of central knot that he was in the network of subject positions and of sources of desire that are kind of unclear. When he's still that narrative center, not only all women desired him, but also all men, including the jealous creator and lord, insistent upon sole possession. And this is in fact the only motivation for his chastity, which is very unlike the biblical. In the biblical text, you don't have any talk about why this chastity is taken for granted, but in the Talmud, in the later commentaries, the suggestion is that he. Now, what made the young Joseph so very special was his status as the true son who was identified with his mother, and you'll remember that Jacob loved Rachel more than anybody else, and then she died. That is, he was the unique love object of his father, who projected onto him his love for the deceased favorite wife. So there is, again, a lot of projection going on there on him. The competition between father and mother, male and female lovers, who struggle for the possession of his beauty, is won by, not by the father, but is given up by the fatherly position. That is, Joseph's story ends when he loses his sonship. He stops being loved by the father when he becomes one. And that is, in fact, the weird transition that I was talking about. Now, arguing against the universalistic fallacy of myth criticism that leads to hatred against women in love, Thomas Mann makes his Joseph represent an attempt at a different kind of universality. And this is going to be my hypothesis, related to my hypothesis about the historical position he's taking. A kind of universality that arises when the limits between subjects are suspended. The general recognition of his lovability calls into question the limits between the self and others. Because there is this, as I said, there is a kind of general process of desire going on. He is the center of it, but there are no limits. Being man and woman himself and being loved by men and women, he becomes the screen onto which everybody is going to project their most problematic feelings. And you'll see a nice instance of that in the handout. Joseph then represents the mythical transference of which Mann's novel is an example and against which the novel struggles. Hence, Joseph himself is a metatextual comment on myth and storytelling. Now, this is all very wild claims, but now we are going to look into the text. The most characteristic scene, and really the most beautiful scene of the whole novel, in this respect, is a scene which I characterize as a general defloration scene, and you have it on your handout. It's a scene that takes place before the famous bed scene, and that's, of course, absolutely not in any of the so-called sources. It's a completely Mannian contribution. The scene represents a case of the junction of artistic and ideological high quality of which Mann prided himself in the foreword to the novel. Now, why is this so wonderful? In the first place, in this talkative text, I'll tell you where. I need your... I think I gave away my copy. I shouldn't have done that. Okay, you have on page 84 in the handout. Okay, in the middle of the, 1, 2, 3, 4, in the like the fifth line of the fourth paragraph, but all the ladies, those who had chance to see him, etc., being lost in the gazing of at the cupbearer, etc. Now, it begins about there. Take it at home and stare at it for a while because it's really interesting. Now, in this very talkative text, as I said, the sheer length of the text makes it already talkative, and also there's a lot of talk, but not as much as in the Bible, comparatively. The character of the woman here cannot speak. The woman has a name here. She's called Mood Amenet. Now, Mood Amenet, and also called Eni as a nickname, is pressed by her women friends to tell them why she is so unhappy and sick. She's been sick for 2 years. Unable to speak, in answer to this request, she stages a scene, and the vocabulary of the theater is in the passage. A scene that can be seen and signify where words fail. She gives a party, and for all the friends who pressed her to tell what was wrong. And at dessert, oranges and very sharp little knives to peel them are distributed. And when the ladies are busy peeling their oranges, hold your breath, Joseph comes in, Sarsib he's called here in Egyptian, comes in to serve the wine. Sheer fright at the sight of his beauty makes all the women cut their fingers, some of them to the bone. And then you get this horrible description, very much in terms of defloration, the blood on the white garments, etc. And then she says, "My loves, whatever has happened to you all? What are you doing? Your blood is flowing." Which is the reaction of the plotting lovesick virgin. Now, her tone, I was kind of exaggerating the tone, but there is the suggestion of this exclamatory tone, insincere, as it was meant to be, receives sincerity. And this is really strange. He is mocking her on the one hand. On the other hand, it gets sincerity from the contiguous comment in which the speaker, the narrator, feels caught in his own play, fails to distinguish between himself and this woman. For he continues, it was a fearful sight. That is, he participates, he partakes of the effect of the stage scene visually. Now, Maud Eminette planned this event with the explicit purpose of making herself understood, and she is called a hypocrite only to the extent that she knows with her brains why the women cut themselves, not because she chose this way of representing her love. That is not blamed. The only blame she gets from the narrator is that she pretends to be surprised, but she's not. But she is a little bit, right? He doesn't distance himself entirely from her surprise. She wanted her friends to understand, to experience her love at the moment of knowing it. That is, she wanted to cut through that distinction. The difference between knowing and experiencing being precisely identification, confusion of subjects. The passage from subjectivity to intersubjectivity. She was not going to tell them, I'm in love, because then she would be an object of gossip. She would be the other. There would be that split. But she makes them participate. Where words fail, understanding is only possible through the suspension of subjective limits. So they all have to feel her love and feel it literally, painfully, and as a shock, so that it becomes theirs. Thus, the split created by discourse is cured by sight. There is no longer a narrative, a third person, an object of gossip. Visuality succeeds where words fail. That's the scheme, and she succeeds entirely. Now, this strategy fits well with Mann's attempt to humanize the woman by generalizing not her crime, but her feelings. That is, by suspending the idea that it was a crime at all, because the feelings become more important, by transgressing the denial of female subjectivity. But at the same time, discursive signifiers produce emotional overtones that symptomatize a less explicit truth. That is, here I'm trying to get at the difference between the transference of others that he's discussing and his own transference. Maud, this woman, Maud Eminette, expresses her surprise at what happens. Your blood is flowing. And the narrator partakes of the effect of the event. It was a fearful sight. The woman not only desires sexual initiation, whose denial symptomatizes the denial for subjectivity, that is, the fact that he doesn't want it, is a denial of her desire. She also fears it, and that is the thing that comes across without being in any way made explicit. Identification with the female man made the perspective of defloration less frightening, but Joseph's refusal was a refusal of that identification. So in other words, her so-called seduction attempt was in fact an attempt, she wanted him because he was also a woman, not only a man. So it was an attempt to, again, to get across those boundaries. Now the general defloration he is innocently guilty of, he causes it without guilt, which links back to our Lucretia discussion, is another way of going through this frightful event. And that's why the narrator says it was a fearful sight. Maud's fright is genuinely cathartic in the classical sense of catharsis in Greek tragedy. This scene is, on another level, also a rehearsal for what happens later, the accusation to Potiphar, which Rembrandt represents in two paintings that we will discuss next week. Like the latter, it has the same aspects of intersubjectivity, of lack of limits between subjects, which is so central in the whole novel. The defloration scene enhances and explains this accusation scene that comes afterwards. It's almost the same thing. Now, this aspect of the novel I was just talking about, and many others, because it is obviously a very rich novel, and we can spend a whole seminar just on this novel. But it's not at all related to the Genesis story, of which is this supposed to be a version. Now, when you read this, how are you going to say this is a version of the Genesis? It doesn't make the slightest sense at all. There is hardly a universal story to refer this scene to. That is, this scene does not pre-exist. Yet it is arguably the most central and the most poignant scene in the book. Whereas Genesis derives its meaning from the very absence of female subjectivity. That is, the woman acts but does not vocalize. She's used, set up in a conflict between men. The scene in Mann's novel stages a dramatic generalization of the woman's ambivalent fears. There's more to this. Although he's not explicitly polemic here, I would suggest, and that is, I think, the challenge of does he stand historically? I suggest that Mann's desire to use a Hebrew myth of the Jew in a foreign country, this is another aspect of the story, confronted by a foreigner in love with him, for this intense dramatization of emotional community, of this attempt to get across limits between people, could only arise from his personal response to the historical moment. While the rise of Nazism, with its neurotic ideology of maleness, don't forget that was a very important aspect in the whole ideology of Nazis, began to make the limits between groups of subjects so absolute as to become soon enough the limits between life and death. That ambivalence, the ambivalence both sexual and ethnic of the encounter between two ambivalent subjects, became an acutely necessary alternative. That is, he's on a very deep level, he is responding to the situation by using language to cut across all possible boundaries where the ideology was trying to set up boundaries. Now, in the biblical story, just a few minutes on the biblical story, the woman obviously functions as a motivator of something else. The text is structured, I would say, let's say in a very quick assessment, around three notions: talk, possession, and the house. Now, the first one, talk, is worked out by Mann, but in a very different way. The second is not at all central in the novel, possession. He doesn't talk about possession. The biblical account talks about it all the time. While the house is only relevant as a setting. So even if you have this difference in length, it's still possible that the short story has elements that the long story doesn't. So even from that perspective, it's impossible to say he worked in the whole biblical story. The dramatic function of the house in Genesis, I don't know if you saw that, and that's why I gave you the two translations, the one in the King James and then the one I did myself, which is not only as literal as possible to the Hebrew, but also to the 17th century Dutch translation. And that's because Rembrandt is supposedly going to work on that basis. Now, there is this dramatic function of the house, which is taken over by the dramatic function of sight in Mann, and it becomes a completely different issue and different story. The repetition in the Genesis story of the filling of Joseph's hand with all it could possibly contain is a business between men, that is, Potiphar and Joseph are here competing, and the handful that he gets, his hand is filled all the time, made me think of Freud's handful of quotes, where he really needs all these confirmations from someone who has the authority. Now, Joseph's reluctance to transgress is therefore an acceptance of the fathers above him in the biblical story. In Thomas Mann's novel, the father is very weak, and the important father is God the Father, who claims his abstinence. So it's not so much God the Father, but God the lover. And his claim, God's claim, involves sexual jealousy in a very clear sense, and opposes, another function of the God is to oppose Joseph's narcissistic lack of realism that we don't see in the Bible either. Now, the house in Genesis, it is the site of power and of bondage, and that is the ambivalence there, which is also pretty interesting. Joseph goes to and fro between inside and outside. The house represents danger and safety, but the outside is of no help when the house is a place of danger. Potiphar returns to the house from which he had to be absent earlier. The function of the house as the frame to be transgressed, as the ambivalent structure of safety versus danger, both, of freedom versus confinement, has the potential of a visual representation which we will find in Rembrandt's works, especially in the etching. There, the house is superseded by its narrative equivalent, the bedroom, and also by the representational equivalent, the frame. The whole structure, which the repetition of the word house in Genesis generates, is not in any way used in this whole novel in Thomas Mann. That is, the house doesn't play any dramatic part. It's just not important. So even on the level of the structure of the story and of the thematic of the story, there is no comparison possible. Mann's myth is not the myth of the young man. It's the myth of the woman who stands for humanity. Emphasizing the position of the woman and its identity with Joseph, Mann questions the very distinction between the sexes, in fact. He uses the story of the son, because all these stories, the Oedipal story, the Totem and Taboo story, is all stories of sons and fathers. Now, Mann uses the story of the son in order to tell the story of the daughter, while making subjective identity futile, so he's undermining it while he's doing it. Thus he introduces as his major theme an aspect totally absent from the biblical story. Now, if we may play on the etymological meaning of the word version as turning, I would like to see Mann's novel as a turning away from Genesis, that is, as an anti-version. Now, in Genesis, I'm almost done here, but I have a few things to say to wind up on the one hand and to prepare for next time on the other. In Genesis, the house is a mediator signifier between the two relationships Joseph is involved in. There are, in fact, two relationships. From his deliverance from the mother's womb to his ascension to worldly power and possessions, the transition between those two moments is signified by condensation in the recurring word house. And you remember the pit. He was first put into a pit, into a dry well. Then he's taken to this house. Then he's taken to the prison, which is in Hebrew also a word house, closed house, etc. But the house, the drama of Joseph is that the house is never his house, and what happens is never his doing. He doesn't do anything. That's his crime, in fact, to do nothing. The words that narrate the story over and over again are not his words. He doesn't talk. On the contrary, Mann's Joseph, in contrast, Mann's Joseph needs no house. It's not an issue. In the Bible, there is this house all the time, and then it's not his. In the Mann, the house is taken for granted, and it's not worked through. And he talks enough, too much. He has no problem talking. At one point, he decides not to talk, but then he acts, if negatively. And that's on his way to Egypt, when he had the opportunity to send a message to his father in the Thomas Mann. He prefers not to send a message to his father. That is, his father, who was so worried about a favorite son who had disappeared, he did not send the message that he was alive. He is so sure of his power that he accomplishes the very act of hubris. He prematurely breaks with his father, and that's what he'll have to pay for. He breaks with his son position, only to become a son in a more stronger sense. Now, after having been thrown back by his brothers into the pit, he emerges from which into slavery represented his renewed birth, of course. That's a very obvious theme in there. He thus voluntarily assumes the position of the newly born once more, the fatherless in search of parents. But his act of hubris is that he pretends not to need any parents. But then there are all these parents who come instead. He does so under the assumption that he needs no father, that he's ready to become one himself. And that is a generational ambiguity that is very much visible in Genesis, especially if you look at the sequence of the Joseph cycle and this very strange insertion of chapter 38, which has nothing to do with Joseph apparently, but which is about sexual initiation. Now, this generational ambiguity that Thomas Mann doesn't work in so much with, not in the same way, is very much developed with Rembrandt, especially in the etching. The analysis of speech act and other acts in both Mann's and the biblical stories will show how deeply these two stories differ. Mann's decision to attack, to diverge from what he takes to be his model, because he does work on the biblical story, shows the function of the mythical screen. He acts upon it, he criticizes it, he works with it, and he cannot help acting beyond his plans. That is, he gets caught in this action of the myth And my claim would be that that is what mythical stories are, in fact. So that you cannot say that there is a mythical story in terms of there is this innocent young man and this seductive woman, etc. There is a structure. That is partly filled in every time differently, but the attraction of stability, the idea that you can think that it's the same story, allows you precisely to make it different and to do something completely different with it. And Thomas Mann, I really love the way he uses this visual scene to make a very violent case for this very modern idea, and in a sense postmodern. In thematics, it's almost a postmodern novel of the limits of the subject that are not very clear and that you can destroy. Okay, now up to you. Not too bad today.